Hello, 4th grade. Mr. Harris again with another video. Getting ready to start our week off with a positive note with some reading again. Today we're going to be focused on thematic links. Thematic links are when you take two paired texts and compare the themes shown between text 1 and text 2 for different purposes. So for today, we'll be using the text that we read last week, Happy Hibernators, and Rick Van Winkle, Cautionary Tale, our new text, in order to answer some questions. As always, I'm going to read through this second text, Rick Van Winkle, and I'll stop for a moment, show you guys the previous text, and then we'll get into answering some of the questions. Alright? At the end of the video, there will be a pop question for you guys to answer, which will be one of the thematic links questions, as well as the attendance question. And if you have any questions, be sure to message me on Class Dojo. So let's jump right in. Rick Van Winkle, A Cautionary Tale. As always with our text, we're going to preview our text, get our genre and our thinking jobs together so that we know what we're working with as we go through this text. So as I scan through this text, I see Rick Van Winkle. That could be a real person, but it says a young squirrel named Rick Van Winkle. And I see Cautionary Tale. So that's giving me the idea that this might be a fable. And we know that fables are works of non-fiction. So let's go ahead and write our genre as non-fiction. So let's go ahead and read this text with our thinking jobs in mind. Remember, we talk about our characters, our problem, our solution, and our lesson learned. Not so many years ago, a young squirrel named Rick Van Winkle spent his days in the central Texas woodlands. Rick was often found loafing under an oak tree. So we have our main character, Rick Van Winkle. And we can write that Rick Van Winkle is a squirrel. His brothers, sisters, and many cousins spent their days harvesting acorns and scavenging pine nuts. Not Rick. He spent his days in idle happiness, preferring to tell fantastic stories and munch on old sour persimmons and plums. His mother would scold him from high up in the branches of a live oak. His father would poke Rick in the backside with a cedar twig. His friends and neighbors would spend their days reminding Rick Van Winkle to get his work done. Rick, though, would just smile, lean his head back against a soft bit of bark, and listen to the wind blow through the leaves of his tall oak tree. So we have some characters here. We have his brothers, sisters, and many cousins. We have his mother and his father. We're just going to put C's there for all our characters, as well as his friends and neighbors. Nobody else with a name yet, but we can tell definitely that Rick was very laid back. Everyone else is working, but Rick is just leaning his head back on a soft bark, listening to the wind blow through the leaves of his tall oak tree. Rick Van Winkle's lazy life of leisure would be forgotten, were it not for a single curious fact. Rick slept through about 20 years of progress and productivity. Contrary to what any Texas wildlife biologist would tell you, Rick managed to hibernate. Texas squirrels don't hibernate, they will say. Impossible, they will shout. Normally, of course, they would be correct. Everyone knows that tree squirrels in Texas enjoy warm winter weather than their northern cousins. Hibernation is unheard of among Texas tree squirrels. Still, Rick Van Winkle managed to peacefully sleep through 2 decades. So we can write on the side that Rick Van Winkle was the first Texas squirrel to hibernate. Just before Rick's 20-year nap, he'd been strolling through the forest one afternoon when he came upon a crowd of wise-looking old possums. They were bowling that day, using a large acorn as their ball and 12 tall pine cones as their bowling pins. Rick took his turn on the lane, knocked down a good number of pine cones, and helped himself to some old sour plums. Before long, Rick tired and walked back to his tall oak as if in a daze. He lay his head on a patch of rotten bark and went fast asleep, and he stayed fast asleep for 20 years. So here we can write, Rick hibernated for 20 years. Rick awoke to a strange sound. A large, excited dog had his front paws on Rick's oak tree, and he was filling the morning with a dreadfully loud barking. He would have woken up the whole forest, but for one thing, there was no forest left. As Rick looked around the branches of his tree, all he saw were green, grassy, fenced yards, new houses, and patio furniture neatly lined up along the edge of sparkling blue swimming pools. Barbecue grills captured the morning sunlight, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. A lawnmower hummed somewhere in the distance. Rick's oak tree still stood tall in its spot. Now, though, the spot was a backyard. The limbs of the oak held a kid's tree house and supported a tire swing. Here, we can write that. Here's our problem. Rick slept through his entire forest being removed. Rick remembered his bowling game with the possum pack. He remembered the sour plums. Rick's little paws trembled, and his tail switched as he remembered the forest as it used to be. He remembered the moles and the mice. He thought of the possums, the skunks, and the armadillos that had been his friends. Raccoons and rabbits had wandered through the woods that were now gone, while wild grapevines had climbed the many trees that were no longer standing. The air had smelled of pine needles and warm earth. Berries and plums had grown from flowers on bushes and trees. He remembered his brothers, his sisters, and his cousins that scrambled from tree to tree to collect the nuts and acorns that lay on the forest floor. His family was nowhere to be seen now. Here we can write, everyone had left, and Rick was by himself. The dog soon lost interest in the motionless squirrel and wandered away. A mockingbird flew up and perched on a branch not far from Rick. What has happened? Rick wondered aloud. Where is the forest? Where are the animals? The mockingbird cocked his little head sideways as he considered the confused squirrel. What are you talking about? This hasn't been a forest for some 15 years. So here we find out that the forest was removed 15 years ago. But, Rick continued, shaking his head, what happened? The mockingbird looked at the neighborhood subdivision. Perhaps this is what happened. The people of the neighborhood, the people of the nearby town began building their houses in the country. Soon, the town grew into a city. The countryside, our forest, became a suburb. Rick looked at his big oak tree. There were some acorns. A pine tree grew in the neighbor's backyard, and a persimmon tree was blooming across the paved street. Would there be enough food for a squirrel? Would he be able to make a life in this new place? There was only one way to find out. Rick quickly began gathering acorns. Here we have our solution. Rick decides to gather food. Alright, so after we stopped and jotted, we get into our lesson learned. And really, for this story, there isn't much of a lesson. We can wonder, maybe if Rick wasn't so lazy, what would have happened? Would he have slept through everything? Would he have lost his family? Maybe not. But we'll understand, as with this story, as with many other stories, that there isn't always a clear lesson learned. So now, I'm going to show you guys the previous story, and you can pause the screen to refresh your memory about what happened there. Alright, now I'm back. And we're going to jump into our questions. Our questions that we're focusing on today are questions number 5, 6, and 8. Questions number 5, 6, and 8. Number 8 is our pop question. So we won't have to worry about that right now. Question number 5. Both selections suggest that A. Forest animals are cute and playful. B. Animals must adapt to changing conditions in order to survive. C. Animal habitat is being lost to the growth of cities. D. Hibernation is a useful adaptation for animals who live in very cold environments. Do we talk about forest animals being cute and playful in our first story, Happy Hibernators? No, we more so talk about, give facts about real animals. We do hear about possums and Rick playing bowling right before he falls asleep for his 20-year nap. So, we can say that that's only RVW. Our initials were Rick Van Winkle. If it's not in both, then we cross it out. Animals must adapt to changing conditions in order to survive. That was everything we learned about in our fiction story. And let me go ahead and make a correction from earlier. I wrote non-fiction, but I meant fiction text. And I'll write it in our description to make sure that we're understanding. I meant fiction. This is a fiction text and not a non-fiction text. So yes, we learn about animals needing to adapt, and we see that after Rick notices all the changes that he slept through, he decides to gather food. He has to adapt again. So we see it in both. But we haven't read through all of our answer choices yet, so we'll write a question mark for now. Animal habitat is being lost to the growth of cities. We only see that in Rick Van Winkle. And we know that because the mockingbird tells us at the end of the story. Hibernation is a useful adaptation for animals who live in very cold environments. While that is true, and we learn about that in hibernating animals, we don't learn about that in Rick Van Winkle. Rick isn't even supposed to hibernate. His cousins up north are. So we can cross that out. We know that our valid answer is choice B. Question number 6. Which of these ideas is found in boat selections? Long, difficult winter conditions? We talk about that a lot in happy hibernators, hibernating animals. We see that we talk about having to store food and having to sleep through the winter because of how cold it is. So you have to drop your body temperature and make your heart beat slower for long periods of time. So we can write HA for hibernating animals and cross that off because that's only one story. Lazy animals that get scolded by their family, we only see that happen in Rip Van Winkle. Our animals and hibernating animals don't even talk, so we don't know if they're lazy or not. Trees that provide nuts and berries in a forest habitat, we could just write that for Rip Van Winkle because we know that he gathers acorns to eat. An animal that hibernates. We see that in both stories. We actually see several animals in hibernating animals, and we see Rick Van Winkle do it for the first time as a Texas squirrel. So we can circle that answer choice. Your pop question for today. Which of the following best describes how the two selections are different? F. Rick Van Winkle is a fictional story. Hibernating animals is a non-fiction article. G. Rick Van Winkle has more believable characters than hibernating animals. H. Rick Van Winkle is realistic fiction. Hibernating animals has a magical plot. J. Both selections tell a fictional story, but only Rick Van Winkle includes a plot problem with a solution. Lastly, I have your attendance question here for today. And it says, if you could grow up to be famous, what would you want to be famous for? So make sure you're answering your pop questions by messaging it to me on Class Dojo. And make sure you're answering your attendance questions to your homeroom teacher. If you could grow up to be famous, what would you want to be famous for? Thank you again for tuning in, 4th grade. Have a great Monday, and I hope to see you on Wednesday.